Chapter 9 of Mag and Margaret, A Story for Girls, by Pansy. Chapter 9 Discoveries. All this time, Mag Jessup, despite her many troubles, was hard at work over the book that Fred Ainsworth had lent her. I do not suppose that a student of history ever worked more faithfully than did she. She had a way of studying that many little girls seem to know nothing about. She would not leave a sentence, if she could help it, until she understood what it meant. Sometimes this made hard and slow work, for Mag did not know many words; but it would not be easy to tell how glad she felt when in this way she learned a new one. The very first sentence in her book had held her for a long time. This is it: "If you look at a map of the world, you will see in the left-hand upper corner of the eastern hemisphere two islands lying in the sea. They are England and Scotland and Ireland." That seems a simple enough sentence, does it not? But Mag had never seen a map of the world, and had not the least idea what it was. Neither did she understand why the book should say two islands, and then speak of three places. Moreover, she did not know what an island was. Now you understand something of the work before her. It chanced that Kate Perkins, on the very day that Mag began her book, had occasion to consult an atlas, and to look at the map of the world. Mag almost dropped the glass of water she was carrying, in her excitement, when she heard Kate, who was bending over a big book, say suddenly: "Oh, the western hemisphere! What an idiot I am! I have been staring at the eastern hemisphere half an hour, trying to find it there." Dear, dear! If only Mag could "stare at the eastern hemisphere" for half a minute, she thought that some of her riddles might be guessed. After the glass of water was safely landed, she hovered near the big book. "If you please, is that a hemisphere?" she asked timidly. "Of course," said Kate, who was busy. "Don't you see it says so?" Sure enough, it not only said that, but in large letters at the top of the page, "Map of the World." Now, indeed, Mag must have just a glimpse. There was no duty for her to fly to at that moment, and the book was large; so by standing rather near Kate and staring with all her might, Mag managed to discover a bright spot that said "England and Scotland," and another that said "Ireland." Only two places and three names! One of the bright spots had two names, then. But what did the word "island" mean? She watched her chance when Kate Perkins raised her head at last from the fine print she was studying, and ventured another question. "Please, Miss Kate, what is an island?" "Why, it is a body of land surrounded by water, of course. What a dunce you are, Mag, for a girl of 13! Mother," turning her eyes for a moment toward Mrs. Perkins, who had just entered the room, "Mag ought to go to school. She doesn't even know what an island is." "Well," said Mrs. Perkins, "she knows what an iron is, and I want her to go and iron towels, instead of chattering to you." Mag went to the towels at once, with satisfaction on her face. She had discovered England, Scotland, and Ireland, and found out what an island was. Why should she not be happy? But that method of study was necessarily slow. On the first page she encountered the words "solitary," "expanse," "cliff," and "adventures," none of which she knew. She wrote them down carefully on the margin of a newspaper, and bided her time. "If you please, Mr. Frederick," she said to him that evening, "could I sometime, when you're not using it, look in your dictionary for 4 words?" "Certainly," he said with great heartiness. "Look in it as often as you like. When you are waiting in the hall for that industrious bell to ring, and hear a word that puzzles you, just rush in here and find its meaning. There is no telling how much knowledge you may be able to get by the means." He laughed at the idea of such a mouse studying the dictionary, and could not know how happy he had made her. Of course, she had not a great deal of time for reading; and as she read over each page again and again, until she was sure that she understood every word in it, and came constantly to words whose meanings she had to wait for a chance to hunt out, it was not strange that at the end of 2 weeks she had read only to the 10th page. But when Fred Ainsworth thought of his experiment and questioned her as to how far she had got, He was much disappointed at the answer. Not 10 pages in all that time! And he had imagined that she might really plunge through it and find the story parts, and learn something. Then he called himself an idiot for supposing that such an ignorant little creature as she could care for a history, however simply written, and thought no more about her. But Mag Jessup was really living all the while in a little world of her own. The girl out of a book, whose company she had enjoyed so much, had made her hungry for other companionship, and in the history of England she found it. In the course of a few weeks, not only Julius Caesar, but the fair Rowena, with whom the king fell in love, and the good Edwin, king of Northumbria, and Queen Edburga, and a host of others, became her intimate acquaintances. Around the little that the book had to tell about these, she threw the power of her imagination, and acted out in her mind all the good deeds that she could imagine of some of them, and grew white with horror over the crimes of Queen Edburga, for instance. Alfred the Great became her hero, and the number of times she played that she was the cowherd's wife, and King Alfred was set to watch her cakes, could not be told. Hero though he was, she could not help being sorry that he so far forgot his duty as to let those cakes burn. I do not know that I can make you understand how entirely this girl of one book made the book a part of her very life. Remember that she was not used to stories, only such as she had been able to imagine for herself, and to have real people brought before her, as they were in this history, to know their names and some of their famous deeds, and to be able to act them out in her own room at night, became a perfect fascination. There was one thing to be always glad over, that little pillows had fallen into her hands before the history. Fascinating as this was, it could never take the place of her first dear book. Every night of her life she read and reread a pillow. When the month was completed, and she had read them all, she began again, with as much interest as though they were new to her. It is difficult also to tell you how much she learned about God and heaven, and her duty, from that one small book. You who have read many books, and who know the story of Jesus coming to earth, and living and dying, and rising from the grave, as well as you know your own names, can hardly understand what it all meant to Mag Jessup. Perhaps, after all, this is the great difference between you. You read a story from the Bible, or elsewhere, and close the book and forget it. Mag read it, and then began to live it. You remember that the very first little pillow invited her to come to Jesus? It said to her, "Will you not say, 'I am coming, Lord Jesus,' and ask him to stretch out his hand and help you to come, and draw you quite close to himself?" How often have you had the same, or a like, invitation? Mag accepted it. She went down on her knees and said those very words, and meant them, and of course Jesus stretched out his hand and helped her. He always does. At the head of every pillow there was a Bible verse, and Mag learned every one of these. One was, "I, even I, am he that blotteth out thy transgressions," and the words that followed explained what it meant. So Mag knew her sins were blotted out, because God said so. There was one that said, "He that keepeth thee will not slumber." Then Mag knew that God would take care of her. There was one that said, "O Lord, thou knowest," and from the explanation she learned that he knew every little thing about her, not only what she said and did, but what she thought. Oh, by the time she had read that book through carefully 3 times, she could have passed a very fair examination on the central truths of religion. As good as you can, my girl, you have been in Sunday school all your life, and read, as I heard a girl of 13 say the other day, more than 200 books. Mag Jessup could have said something that that girl of 13 could not, that as fast as she found out a truth she set herself to work to live by it. Because of these things the little girl's life had not been entirely miserable, even while she was passing through her trial. And when she discovered that "all things work together for the good to them that love God," and then had it proved to her so suddenly, and actually had a whole Bible all her own given to her, there was not to be found in the city, perhaps, a happier girl than Mag Jessup. But new experiences were in store for her. In the first place, Miss Ordway, who, besides the kindly feeling that she had had from the first toward the lonely little girl, could not help thinking that she owed her a special kindness, because she had been to her the occasion of a special trouble, hit upon a way of showing it that gave Mag much pleasure. " How well that little brown creature would look in bright colors," she said one day to Fred Ainsworth, as he lingered with her over a new flower she had just finished, and brought down to show him, and Mag passed the door on one of her many errands. " She has just the right complexion for something pink, and her eyes are bright enough to match it. I think she has lovely eyes." " She would look well in anything fresh and girlish," grumbled Fred, " and she never has anything. I don't see why Mrs. Perkins wants to make such a guy of her. She is the last creature in the world to wear blue, anyway, and by the time Kate Perkins gets through with her blue things they look more like gray ones. I'd like to see the mouse dressed up once, just for the sake of finding what a difference clothes can make. She ought to be in my Aunt Annie's hands for a little while. My Aunt Annie's an artist in dress, Miss Ordway. She studies my cousin Margaret's clothes as you do a picture, and the result is striking. I suppose poor little Mag will never have anybody to study dress for her. It seems a pity, doesn't it, to see such a young creature as she so alone in the world. My, what I would do if " He left the sentence unfinished. But Miss Ordway, who had become quite good friends with him, guessed that it might be, " what I would do if my mother and father were not coming home next fall." And she could easily see why such a sentence might be left unfinished. The talk set her to thinking. She tossed her head a little over that remark about his Aunt Annie, and said to herself that she guessed there were other artists in dress as well as she. Then she thought of a pretty wrapper that lay in the bottom of her trunk, with a stain on the front breadth that had been impossible to get out. But it wouldn't be impossible to cut around it; and she had new pieces like the goods; enough, she believed, to make a handsome dress for a little girl. Why shouldn't she please herself by seeing how the child would look in it? Miss Ordway had been used all her life to pleasing herself, so that very afternoon she got out the wrapper, and the new pieces, and studied them instead of her next flower piece; and went down town and bought a pattern that her skilled eye saw would suit Mag's form and harmonize with the pieces, and before bedtime had the pleasure of having planned out the entire dress. She was a woman of business; therefore she took the planned out dress the next morning to a woman who did plain sewing, and sat for an hour with her, planning and directing. An old dress of Mag's had been secured as guide, and the sewing woman agreed that there could be no doubt but the pattern would fit " middling well." The idea grew. Before the dress was ready to be tried on, Miss Ordway had discovered among her laid away trinkets a roll of brown satin ribbon and a bunch of poppies, and had bought a brown straw hat that matched the ribbon, and concocted out of them all a hat that she knew would look well with the dress. It was drawing toward spring now, and a brown straw hat was just the thing to have. But how horrid they would both look with that old gray sack that was much too large for Mag, and not of the right shape, anyway. Miss Ordway happened on 16th Street one morning when a special sale of outside garments was announced, and there she found a brown sack so exactly fitted to the brown hat, and offered for such a ridiculously low price, that it would have been a shame not to have bought it. So she bought it. Then she stopped at the sewing woman's to find that the dress was ready for the trying on, the woman feeling sure that there would be almost no altering needed. She knew that slip of a girl, had often seen her pass. The waist seams might need a little letting out, but she didn't believe it. That kind of pattern was always made large, giving them room to grow. So now everything was ready for a grand surprise. Miss Ordway left the hat and sack at the sewing woman's, and agreed to call with Mag that very Saturday afternoon if she could, in the hope that she could transform her, and carry her home to show Mr. Fred Ainsworth that she, too, was " an artist in dress." Chapter 10